In August 1812, a young Swiss explorer named Johann Burckhardt rode through a narrow stone gorge in southern Jordan, disguised as a Muslim merchant, and emerged into a valley of carved facades, rock-cut temples, and abandoned cisterns. He was the first European in 1500 years to walk through the city of Petra. The local Bedouin had always known it was there. The world Burckhardt came from had completely forgotten. Petra had not been destroyed. It had not been conquered, sacked, or starved. It had simply stopped being useful. For nearly 7 centuries, from roughly 300 BC to 363 AD, Petra had been one of the wealthiest cities on Earth, the capital of the Nabatean kingdom and the master gatekeeper of the spice trade between the Indian Ocean, southern Arabia, and the Mediterranean. Then, over the course of 2 centuries, the trade went somewhere else. Petra slowly emptied out. By 700 AD, it was effectively a ghost town. By 1100 AD, only a Bedouin clan and the occasional pilgrim knew it existed. The Nabateans were originally desert nomads from northwestern Arabia. They appear in records around the 4th century BC as a people who controlled the caravan routes carrying frankincense and myrrh from southern Arabia and Yemen up the western edge of the Arabian Peninsula to the Mediterranean. The 2 resins were essential to ancient Mediterranean ritual life. Frankincense burned in temples from Alexandria to Rome. Myrrh used in everything from embalming fluid to perfume to wound treatment. Both came from a small number of trees that grew only in southern Arabia and the Horn of Africa. Whoever controlled the route between supply and demand controlled enormous wealth. The Nabateans positioned themselves at a strategic choke point. Petra sits in a high desert valley, reachable only through narrow rock canyons with reliable spring water in a region where reliable water is rare. Caravans heading north from Arabia had to stop at Petra. They paid taxes, they paid for water, they paid for protection through the territory beyond. The Nabatean state grew rich on the toll. What they did with the money was build. They carved monumental tomb facades into the sandstone cliffs. They constructed an elaborate water management system, over 200 dams, cisterns, and ceramic pipe networks that turned a desert valley into a garden. They built theaters for thousands. They imported Greek architects and Egyptian craftsmen. By the 1st century BC, Petra had perhaps 30,000 residents living in carved-out city blocks, supplied by the inflows of caravan tax. The Roman geographer Strabo, writing around 7 BC, described it as a wealthy and law-governed city. The Romans annexed the Nabatean kingdom in 106 AD under Emperor Trajan. The annexation was peaceful, there is no record of a war, and the city continued to prosper for another century. The Romans extended a paved highway through Petra, the Via Nova Traiana, connecting it to the broader Roman provincial network. New temples went up. New buildings filled in the spaces between the older facades. For a brief generation, Roman Petra was as wealthy as Nabatean Petra. The decline began for reasons no one in Petra could have controlled. In the 2nd century AD, Roman merchants began sailing directly to southern Arabia and India through the Red Sea. The technology was not new. Greco-Roman sailors had known about the seasonal monsoon winds for centuries. But the political stability of the early Roman Empire made these voyages routine and profitable. A Roman captain could load his ship at the Egyptian port of Berenice on the Red Sea, sail to the spice ports of Hadramaut, return with cargo, and bypass the entire overland route through Petra. Several captains' logs survive. They show round trips that took less than a year and made fortunes. The caravan trade did not vanish overnight. There were goods that did not travel well by sea, and there were inland markets that the seaborne trade did not reach. But the volume diminished, and so did Petra's tax revenue. Then, in 363 AD, a major earthquake struck the region. The Petra Theatre, the central market, much of the residential city, all damaged. Ordinarily, a wealthy city would have rebuilt. Petra had less to rebuild with. Some structures were repaired, many were not. The slide accelerated through the late Roman and Byzantine periods. A Byzantine bishopric was established in the city, and a Byzantine church was built over a former Nabatean temple in the 5th century. Recent excavations of this church recovered a cache of carbonized papyri, a small archive of legal documents preserved by the very fire that destroyed the building they were stored in. The papyri date to the 530s and 540s AD. They show a city that still had laws, still had property disputes, still had administrators, but had shrunk dramatically. Most documents reference a relatively small population and several record property transfers from absentee owners who had relocated to other cities. A second major earthquake struck in 551 AD. Byzantine resources for repair were exhausted by then. The empire was simultaneously dealing with the plague of Justinian, ongoing wars with Persia, and revenue shortfalls across the eastern provinces. Petra's water management system fell out of regular maintenance. Without the cisterns and the spring channels, the agricultural margin around the city collapsed. By the 7th century, when the Arab-Muslim conquests reached the region, Petra was no longer a defended administrative center. It was a half-empty stone valley with a Christian congregation small enough to be incorporated peacefully into the new Islamic political order. The Crusaders briefly noticed Petra in the 12th century, building a small fortress on top of one of the surrounding peaks. They abandoned it within a generation. After that, the only people who entered the valley were Bedouin herders, the occasional Mamluk patrol, and the Bedouin clan called the Bedouin, who lived in the carved-out tombs as homes through into the 20th century. The European world's memory of Petra came from a passing reference in the Hebrew Bible to a city called Selah in the land of Edom, and from Strabo's geography. By the medieval period, even those references were not connected to the place. What Burckhardt restored in 1812 was the connection between text and place. He recognized the description of the Selah of the Bible. He recognized Strabo's description of the wealthy law-governed Petra of the early Roman Empire. He guided himself through the gorge by quoting these texts to the Bedouin who escorted him, asking after particular landmarks, a sacrificial shrine, a paved approach. The Bedouin knew these places by their own names. Burckhardt mapped the names onto the texts. The result was the rediscovery of one of the most famous lost cities in history, a place that had been hidden in plain sight for 1,500 years. What is striking about Petra's decline is how undramatic it was. There is no famous battle, no clear collapse year, no archaeological destruction layer that says here is when it ended. The city declined in slow proportion to the trade that had built it. The Bedouin clans who lived in its ruins for the next 1,000 years did not consider it a lost city. They considered it home. The lostness was always a European construction, the gap between the texts that described Petra and the texts that lacked it. Petra was not abandoned because the Romans fell, or the climate changed, or invaders sacked it. It was abandoned because the root it sat on stopped mattering. The frankincense and myrrh trade went to ships. The pilgrims went elsewhere. The tax base evaporated. Without the role it had built itself around, the city simply stopped being worth maintaining. It is one of the cleanest examples in ancient history of how a place can die not from any single cause, but from the slow obsolescence of the function that gave it meaning.